Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. About 2.5 years ago, Anbernic released the RG477M. And when it first released, I remember calling it the best handheld that they had ever made. It had a beautiful metal shell, a 4-inch screen, was super pocketable, and also was pretty good in terms of performance at the time. Now since then, we've seen a couple other handhelds that are similar to the RG475M. There's the RG35XXH, which has a similar form factor but made out of plastic and a 3.5-inch screen. And then also we have the RG406H, which is also Android-based, but not quite as pocketable because it was a bit more rounded. Well, today I think we have finally seen the true successor to the RG405M, and it's their latest release, the RG477M. This one also has a metal shell and a ton of improvements over that last one, including a 4.7-inch 120Hz display with a resolution of 1280 by 960. It's also running the Dimensity 8300, their most powerful Android-based CPU. And perhaps most importantly, it still has that ultra-slim profile like the RG405M, which I really loved. And when you put this all together, it feels like a classic Anbernic handheld, those that we've seen over the past 5 and 6 years, but refined to a T. And if you're like me and you prioritize playing your favorite retro games, but in the most optimized way possible, I think this one checks a lot of blocks. In fact, I would argue that this might be the closest Anbernic has ever come to making a perfect handheld within their own little niche. As you can imagine, we've got a lot to talk about, so grab your favorite snack and drink. Let's go ahead and get started. Alright, let's jump into the specs. So I already mentioned it has the Dimensity 8300 as its CPU. This is an 8-core processor that has a lot of power to it. It's the same chip that we saw in the RG557 released earlier this year. And there's going to be 2 different SKUs with this handheld, an 8GB RAM model, which will have 128 gigs of storage, and then also a 12GB model that will double that storage. And we've also seen this display before. It's the same one found in their previous RG slide, so 4.7 inches, 1280 by 960 resolution, and a 4:3 aspect ratio. Another important factor is that it has a 120Hz refresh rate. We'll talk about that later. As far as battery, we got a pretty standard size, 5300 milliamp hours, and it also allows for 27-watt fast charge. And because it's an aluminum handheld with a larger screen, it is pretty heavy. It's 355 grams or 12.5 ounces. As far as connectivity, we've got Wi-Fi 6E, Bluetooth 5.3, and it does have a 3.5mm headphone jack. And then finally, it is running Android 14 and has USB-C video out, and it can charge at the same time. Now, Anbernic has not officially announced their price and release date, but there was a leak on one of the Discord servers that just kind of blew up everywhere, and so we have a lot of the information now. I was able to get confirmation from the company that the dates that they had in that leak were not accurate. It's actually going to be coming out on August 2nd, and there will be no pre-order period, so as soon as you order it, they should be able to ship it. Like with all their devices, they'll have an early bird period of 72 hours where it'll be a little bit cheaper. So the starting price at that point will be $220 for the 8GB model or $270 for the 12GB model. Once that period ends, the MSRP is going to be $240 and $290 respectively, and so from then on, you'll probably have to wait for sales to get it back down to that early bird price. One thing to bear in mind that all of these prices are before shipping, and so it's usually about $10 to $20 depending on where you're living, in addition to this price you see here. So number one, yeah, this is an expensive handheld, but the prices are aligned to the RG557, which came out earlier with the same processor. So I'm not super surprised by it, and the fact that it has a metal shell, that often will drive up the price as well. Now, if you're wondering whether or not to get the 8 or 12GB model, I think that for emulation, especially the platforms that do the best with this particular chipset and this form factor, I think that 8GB is going to be plenty of RAM. If you really want to push it with things like Switch emulation or maybe try out things like Win later, then I could see the 12GB having a purpose, but as I'll show throughout this video, I'm not really sure those are the best use cases for this device anyway. And so personally, if I was to buy one of these models, it would be the 8GB version, unless I really wanted to have additional internal storage. Now, the model we're looking at here today is a review unit sent over from Anbernic, but like with all my videos, all opinions are my own, no money was exchanged in any way, and they're not going to see this video ahead of time. And they've got 2 color options, one called Silver Blade and Chocolate Bronze. I have the silver one, obviously, and they also sent the 12GB model. But like I mentioned, I haven't seen any bottlenecks when it comes to RAM, and so I think that 8GB will be just good enough when it comes to emulation. Now, inside the box, we've got the handheld itself and a couple other surprises underneath. In addition to your standard stuff like a charging cable and a quick start guide, they've also got a screen protector and then also a rubber casing. And so this is what it looks like with this rubber casing around it. And it doesn't provide like any additional ergonomics or whatever, but it does make it a little bit grippier. But personally, I like the feel of the metal. So let's talk about the handheld as it is. So first impressions here, this thing feels very sleek and premium and very Anbernic. To me, this is like the quintessential Anbernic handheld. You know, this form factor and this kind of candy bar shape and these inline shoulder buttons, rubber pads on the back, all of it is very familiar. It reminds me of some of the very first handhelds from them I ever owned. I'm not particularly sold on this color. It feels kind of unfinished, like they just took it right off the press where they had it machine made or whatever, and then they just slapped everything else on it. I kind of wish that it had a little bit of a different color or alloy to it. Now, personally, I've learned to live with this kind of raw look, but you know, if you want something that's a little bit more refined, then maybe the chocolate bronze one will be a better fit. Now, because we have a much larger screen, 4.7 inches versus 4, we do have a larger device, and I think that makes sense. I'm personally amazed that the thickness between the two is almost identical. The new one is a little bit thicker, but it's just really splitting hairs. Another key difference is the new one has a D-pad centric layout, which I think is actually a really good move. That was one of my minor complaints about the original 475M, was that it was analog stick centric, but I found myself mostly playing D-pad games with it. So this one kind of remedies that, and I think it's a good fit for the majority of the games that you will probably be playing on this handheld. And then finally, my last impression here was that the device is surprisingly sharp along the edges. Now, it is rounded along the sides, you can see that here, and it does look and feel good, but you can also see that there's a bit of a cutoff here, like there's a panel, and then it just kind of cuts off and then gets to the rounded part. So it's not a seamless transition. If you look at the original 405M, you can see that the roundedness is a bit more seamless, and so I appreciate this one more. It feels a little bit more rounded right here on my palm. Now, it's not a bad feeling by any means with this new one, but I can definitely feel that edge as I'm holding it, and it makes it just a tiny bit less premium than I was hoping. But I think in general, that's a minor observation on a handheld that overall feels very premium. I love the feeling of like buttons and D-pad pressing against a metal shell. There's nothing really like it. Speaking of buttons and D-pad, let's talk about the controls and I/O next. The D-pad is a classic Anbernic style with a rubber membrane connection and a lot of good resistance and feedback. And over the past few days of testing, I've come to the conclusion that this might be the best D-pad they've ever put on a metal handheld. It easily passes my Contra test. If I press down on the D-pad and gently rock it left and right, the character stays in place. But if I rock it with a little bit more force, it does move the character, and that is a perfect balance for me. And so in a number of different precision platforming games, including Contra, as well as stuff like Celeste, it has been an excellent fit. It feels like there are no missed or accidental diagonals. And the same thing occurs in games where you want to have an easy diagonal like Street Fighter 3 Third Strike. I'm able to do my Hadoukens and Shoryukens with absolutely no issue. So it's not often that I say this, but I feel like this is basically a perfect D-pad for retro gaming, especially with a metal shell, which I think is harder to pull off compared to a plastic shell. Next up, we have the analog sticks. Now, these are not the most recent capacitive sticks they've released previously. Instead, these are the Hall sensor sticks that we saw last year. And honestly, I think that's a good thing. These are essentially the same as you would find on a Retroid or Odin 2 device. That means you can pull off the caps, and then you can add something else. Maybe you want something a little bit higher or lower. You have the ability to tweak it yourself. Not only that, they feel really nice. They have a wide range of motion, and they also, because they're Hall sensor, are not going to be as prone to stick drift. Now, these sticks do protrude from the shell quite a bit, more than anything else, so there is a risk that maybe they'll catch on your pocket when sliding them in, but still overall, it's a very thin handheld. We're looking at about 15.5 millimeters with the shell alone, and then with the sticks, it's about 21.25. And as far as the sticks themselves, they are super accurate and feel very smooth, so I'm able to move them exactly where I want to, no cardinal snapping or anything. And so it is really a joy to play analog stick-centric games. You know, something like Super Mario 64. You can run, you can walk, you can move in any direction you want. So yes, I think these are excellent sticks. The analog sticks also have RGB lighting around them, and you can configure them however you would like within the settings. So you can make them one solid color, or you can change them to be like a rainbow effect, or to cycle through the colors and so on. Personally, I've just been leaving them off, but obviously you do you. Below that, we've got a couple menu buttons. This is the RG launcher button, so if you press this, it'll open up their own front end, but in these settings, you can program it to open up your own front end if you would like. And then we've got our Android button, so if you tap on this, it'll be a back button, or if you press and hold, it will be a home button within the Android menu. Next up are the face buttons. So these are rubber membrane and glossy, much like many other Anbernic buttons, and they feel very good. So they have a nice springiness to them, and they are not scraping against the sides of the shell either. And so yeah, these feel very good, and they're very quiet. And then finally on the bottom here, we have our select and start buttons. And one minor complaint I have here is that, the positioning of these buttons is always a little bit awkward just to be able to have to move your thumb down to press down on them. So ideally they would be like closer up here, like on the Nintendo Switch, but it's a minor complaint. And it's essentially the same layout as the RG475M, with the start and select down here, but with a larger handheld, it does make your thumb have to reach a little bit further down. So it's just slightly more annoying than it was on this one. On the top, we have our shoulder and trigger buttons, a power button, volume up and down, our charging indicator, and then our exhaust vent for our active cooling fan. Now, the shoulder and triggers are actually a little bit different than your typical ones from Anbernic. They stick out quite a bit from the shell, and they are also more rounded along the edges than I've seen previously. The buttons themselves are micro switches and very easy to press down on, but they are also the loudest buttons on the handheld. Not super loud, but just enough for you to notice them. On the bottom, we've got two down-firing stereo speakers, our USB-C charging port, which can also give you video out, our headphone jack, and then a micro SD card slot. On the back, we have the signature Anbernic pads, which are usually found on their flatter devices, but these are a little bit different of a texture. They are a harder rubber, and they have a nice texture to them as well. Usually these are like a soft rubber, and they're glued on, but these are actually within the shell. Like this shell itself goes over the rubber bumpers. They are super thin as well, so they don't stick out from the device that much, but they're just there to kind of catch your fingers as you're holding it, so the device doesn't slip out. And then finally, we've got our fan intake, and that's about it in terms of I/O. Now, I think one of the more important aspects of this device is really understanding how it feels in the hand, because that's probably one of the big features of this handheld. So let's do some size and weight comparisons. My first example is going to be the RG Slide, just because these have the exact same screen. You can see that when opened up, it is quite a bit bigger than the 477M, but when you close up the Slide, it's about the same size, but not quite as wide. Now, comparing it to devices that are of a similar form factor, we have the RG35XXH, the RG405M, and also the Retroid Pocket Mini version 2. Beyond that, we've got the RG Cube and Cube XX, and then the RG406H. And you can see that between the two, these ones are actually kind of the closest in size, even though this has a much bigger screen up top. Another similar size would be the new Nintendo 2DS XL, as well as the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. These are around the same width and height. And moving on to wider handhelds, we have the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, as well as the Retroid Pocket 5, the Odin 2 Mini, and then the Nintendo Switch Lite. And even though these are different screen dimensions, I think it really goes to show how big that 4.7-inch 4:3 aspect ratio display is on the device we're reviewing today. You're still going to be able to find handhelds bigger than it, like the RG557 or the original Odin, or even the Steam Deck, but I think that for 4:3 devices, this might be one of the more impressive options out there. Now, that big size and metal form factor do make it heavy, so it's 355 grams. That makes it nearly twice the weight of something like the RG35XXH, and then it just keeps going up from there. In fact, the majority of the devices we did size comparisons with are not as heavy as the RG477M. You've got to go all the way up to the RG557 to find something of a similar weight. When it comes down to it, there are very few smallish devices that are heavier than the RG477M. We've got things like the RG Slide, but beyond that, you have to go to like Odin 2 and Steam Deck territory. So yes, as far as 4:3 devices go, this is one of the biggest ones I've ever seen, but because it's so thin, it's also surprisingly pocketable. I'm not sure how often I would want to walk around with it just because it is quite heavy, but the fact that it slides in and out of the pocket is pretty compelling. To give you an idea, here's my iPhone 15 Pro non-max, and you can see that the size is not that far off. Yes, it is wider and taller, but overall it's still of a pretty similar design. And it's not often that we find a handheld with this much power and this large of a screen that can also easily fit in most large pockets. And for me, it kind of feels like a dream handheld, something that can play up through the PS2 catalog at an upscaled resolution, no problem, and still fit in your pocket. That's kind of crazy. And even though I like the premium feel of this metal handheld, I kind of wish they made a plastic one as well, because I feel like it would be a lot lighter and I'd actually carry it around in my pocket instead of this big old brick. Speaking of big old brick, let's talk about the ergonomics. So like I mentioned already, it is basically flat along the back. Now, even though it doesn't have any ergonomic grips on the back, it's still pretty comfortable to hold just because it is a relatively large handheld. So there is plenty of space for all of my fingers on the back. And when it comes to D-pad centric gaming, it's a very comfortable experience. Your hands just kind of naturally wrap around, and then your thumbs just automatically naturally rest right here. So a very comfortable experience when it comes to retro gaming. The only thing I found uncomfortable by comparison is reaching up to these trigger buttons, just because they are in line and they are not stacked. So when you're playing, you kind of have to reach around the back to reach those triggers, and that can be a bit of a stretch. Now, when playing most games, it's more of a nuisance than anything, except when playing something more modern or a first-person shooter. The combination of the high triggers and the lower analog sticks does make it feel a bit like a claw grip. And so in this particular instance, I don't really like playing this type of games with this handheld. Something like a 3D printed grip might fix that in the future, but for now, just out of the box, this is not the ideal way to play this particular handheld, just because of the distance from the analog sticks to those triggers. So overall, I would say the ergonomics here are pretty good, and they're about what I expected, in the sense that yes, playing games like this is not as comfortable as I would like, but playing them D-pad centric is great, and you can still access your shoulders and triggers pretty easily. Okay, let's talk about this screen. We'll start by talking about just the overall brightness and the colors. As far as color balance, this is about what I expected from this display because it's the same as the RG Slide. So it's an LCD panel, it's not OLED, but you can still see that the colors are pretty nice. They don't pop as much as OLED, and I wish they were a bit more saturated, but overall I think that the balance here is good. As far as brightness, we've got a wide range here. In fact, for the most part, I usually play it around 30 to 50% brightness. But if we crank it up all the way to 100%, you can see that yes, it is quite bright. In fact, I would say that you can comfortably play this outdoors in most lighting scenarios. In direct sunlight, probably at around noon, it might be a little bit much. But, in the late afternoon, like I'm filming right here around 4 o'clock p.m., yeah, this is great. So in general, I would say this is plenty bright for most use cases. Now, when it comes to dimness, it also gets very dark. This is at its lowest brightness setting right here, and even turning off the studio lights right here, you can only barely see the screen. That's a good sign. This to me means that you will probably be able to play this device in a dark environment, for example, playing it in bed. You combine that with the quiet buttons here, that's actually a pretty good example. Another big benefit of this display is that it has a 120 Hz refresh rate. I just recently did a video talking about some of the tricks you can do to improve motion clarity with a high refresh rate screen. I will leave a link down below. And so even though most games that you'll be playing on this device run at 60 frames per second, that 120 Hz refresh rate display actually really helps when it comes to retro gaming because it reduces motion blur. Now, in terms of audio quality, I think it is decent here. We do have downward firing speakers, and the device is relatively thin, so we don't have space for large speakers, but in terms of just getting the job done, I think they're pretty good. It gets pretty darn loud and then also has pretty good distinction between the lows, the highs, and the mids. Let me give you an example here. Okay, let's very briefly talk about the software experience. Now, in general, you can get to most of these settings within the Anbernic system here in the top-down menu. So here, for example, you can adjust the CPU mode. They have two different ones, auto mode, which is like their low-powered mode, then they have one called high mode. In general, I only really use high mode for harder to run GameCube games, PS2, and then beyond. You've also got a couple different fan profiles. I generally leave it on auto, but you can set it manually as well. We'll do some audio tests here in a moment. This is also where you will go to change your ABXY layout. I prefer to use it in the Xbox mode, and then this is also where you can change your RGB lighting on the sticks. One other thing worth noting is the rumble motor on this handheld is quite buzzy, to the point where I found it relatively unpleasant. And unfortunately, in the software, Anbernic does not have any options to make it low or high or anything else like that. It's just like one single strength, and I think it's too much. So what I did is I went into the Android settings, and then under audio and vibration and haptics, I just turned the vibration off overall. It's kind of a dramatic setting because that means that no games are going to run with vibration, but honestly, I've preferred to play this without vibration than with it on. Beyond that, in the Android settings, there is now a handheld game console setting. So within here, we can do things like calibrate or test our joysticks. You also have the option to change what the RG button does. You can see I now have it set for emulation station. That means if I press and hold this RG button, it'll bring up emulation station. And this is like working as its home launcher. If I go down here, there's no quit option or anything. That means that in order to get out of it, I can press and hold the RG button to get back to the Android desktop. This is something that you normally cannot do with other handheld, so I really like that. Beyond that, we've just got the same settings for our fan and our RGB lights. Now, this is an Android-based handheld, which means it's going to come basically like a phone or a tablet, but it does come pre-installed with a bunch of emulators. Now, what I did is I deleted a lot of these ones and then I added my own, but if you are looking to basically have something preloaded with emulators, yes, they're going to have it. If you've never set up one of these things before, I would recommend checking out my Android handheld starter guide. I made it a few months ago, and it'll apply to this handheld as well. I personally like starting from scratch, but they will have a bunch of emulators pre-configured. And in my most recent RG557 review video, I actually talked about the fact that you can buy a preloaded card if you would like, and it'll work in conjunction with these emulators. It's a pretty seamless process, but personally, I don't think it's optimized the way that I would do it if I did it myself. Either way, I will leave a link to the RG557 video down below, and I'll timestamp it to that section if you want to see what it's like if you want to use Anbernic's own software. But for the purposes of this video, I used my own emulators and my own ROMs and everything else, and so that's the performance we're going to talk about. So now let's jump into performance, and we'll start by talking about benchmarks. Now, benchmarks are not a 100% indication of the performance you can expect, but it does give us some neat insights. So the first thing I did is I tested 3D Mark's Wildlife Extreme test against a bunch of similar handhelds. I've got today's RG477 on the top left, and then on the top right is the Retroid Pocket Mini with the Snapdragon 865. Below the Retroid Pocket Mini, we've got the RG Slide with the T820 chipset inside. This is from the 406 line of Anbernic handhelds. And then on the left, we've got the T618 inside of the RG405M. And in terms of score, you can see that the RG477M handily beats all these others, especially something like the RG405M. We're looking at a device that's about 20 times more powerful than the one below it. Now, this 3D Mark score of 2767 is actually lower than it was on the RG557. I got around 3200 on that device. It's a little bit strange considering that they are the exact same chipset, but my guess here is that they tweaked the CPU governor to make it not quite as hot running, considering the fact that this is a metal handheld and it is very thin. Regardless, you can see that this device does have quite a bit of power compared to things like the Retroid Pocket Mini and the RG Slide, even though those two devices on the right cost about $200. The next level of handhelds that will actually beat the RG477M are going to be those with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 or equivalent processors, things like the Odin 2 handheld. Now, when it comes to performance on these higher-end Android handhelds, I usually have two major concerns. The first is fan noise, like how loud is this thing going to get? And then also, how hot is it going to get? Because, there's going to be heat transfer from the CPU, and with a metal shell, that is a pretty big concern. Let's start with the fan noise, and I would say that it is relatively loud. The noise level is about 45 decibels in the studio right now, but when I turn on the high fan, it goes up quite a bit to around 62 decibels. And that is definitely loud enough for you to notice while playing and probably the person sitting next to you as well. On top of that, I can hear a bit of a coil whine in the fan, so it's a little bit on the annoying side for me. So let me give you an audio sample right here as I toggle between the auto and strong mode so you can hear how the fan sounds when it kicks in and that coil whine as well. So yeah, like I said, this is loud enough for it to be distracting and potentially distract the person next to you as well. Now, in terms of heat transfer, I was pleasantly surprised to find that this thing does not get that hot even when pushing it quite a bit. After about an hour of playing PS2, I found that the highest temperature on both the front and the back was about 32 degrees Celsius. What I found is that the heat gets enough that you can notice it, and you might feel that it's warm, but not to the point of ever feeling hot or actually making my hands sweat. For reference, the human body internal temperature is 37 degrees Celsius, so it never gets close to that. If anything, I would say that when playing high-end stuff, you will get a gentle reminder that this is a metal shell and that it is warming up, but never to the point where I felt it actually got hot or unpleasant. It is worth noting though that even when playing lightweight stuff with the fan turned off, it gets a little bit warm in the hand. And so what I found an easy fix is to actually just put it in auto. And that means that even when playing something like Super Nintendo, the fan's just going to go a little bit, enough to kind of circulate things to the point where it stays nice and cool. So that is my recommendation, is to set it to auto, even though it does affect the battery life a little bit, which we'll talk about later. So next, let's talk about gaming performance. I'm going to run through basically everything that I can think of. So we'll start with the lightweight stuff and work our way up. When it comes to Game Boy and Game Boy Color, it's a really excellent fit. You'll get some black borders on the left and right, but they are relatively minimal. It's not going to run at a perfect integer scale, but it's a 6.7 scale instead. Now, you can use all sorts of interpolation shaders or just use it in integer scaling, but either way, you've got a lot of room to work with, and the screen is going to be massive. It is 4.2 inches when playing Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Moving on from there, we've got Game Boy Advance with its 3:2 aspect ratio. This is also not perfect integer scaled. It's a 5.3x scale, but still very close and super sharp as well. And it's going to be about 4.5 inches with this size screen. You're going to get some slight black bars in the top and bottom, but I don't mind this much at all either. And so I think this is an excellent Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance display. To give you an idea of what it looks like with integer and non-integer scaling, here's Game Boy Advance, and this is non-integer scaling, so that means it is 4.5 inches diagonally. If I go into the settings here and turn on integer scaling, you can see it gets slightly smaller, and so instead of being 4.5 inches, it's going to be 4.3 inches, which is still very impressive. And so this is what it looks like with integer scaling turned on. The black bars on the left and right are a little bit more prominent, but not that bad. Given the fact that we have such thin bezels around the display itself, it actually just kind of looks like a standard handheld at that point. So yeah, I think it looks very good with integer scale turned on as well. Now moving on to 4:3 systems, this is where it looks even better. So things like Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, it feels like they were built for this screen. Not only does the high resolution give us a lot of scaling options, but we can also take advantage of other things because of that 120 Hz refresh rate, including things like black frame insertion and shader subframes, which I mentioned before. When you combine that with a CRT shader, some of these games look better than I've ever seen them before on a 4:3 display. It's not a perfect screen. For example, if it was OLED, I think it would pop even more, but man, I cannot complain about how good these games look in 4:3. When it comes to Super Nintendo in particular, my favorite combination has been using that CRT beam shader in combination with the Pixel AA shader, which is balancing out the pixels without applying any additional CRT filter. This makes the images super sharp and crisp, but also nice and balanced. And so this is the ideal way for me to play Super Nintendo, at least right now. I've also really enjoyed playing arcade titles as well. One of my favorite combinations has been the CRT Beam shader along with the CRT Geom Deluxe shader. This is a more demanding shader, but this CPU can handle it no problem, and it provides for a very accurate CRT look. And so yeah, I've really been enjoying this. It gives the image a bit of a softer look, but I think that is actually pretty fitting with these old school games. If you're looking for something a little bit more crisp, but with also that CRT look, then I'd recommend checking out something like the CRT Consumer shader. This is an excellent fit too. And because the device is so large, I don't really mind playing vertical games, even though it gives me these black bars on the left and right. It's so big that this is actually playable for me. It's just one of the many advantages of having a 4.7-inch display like this is that it gives us a lot of versatility. Now let's move on to the 3D-based home console systems, things like PS1 and beyond. For lightweight PS1 games, I found that you can even use things like a CRT Beam and CRT Royale preset combination. This is very heavy duty and something that I would only really reserve for high-end devices, but again, we've got enough power to be able to do that. Not every PS1 game can handle it. For example, the harder to run games like Tekken 3 will just have to use something a bit more simple. So here I'm just using the CRT Beam shader and it still looks awesome. And the great thing about some of these 3D-based systems is that they either played at 240p or 480p, which means they will scale up perfectly to the 960p resolution that we have on this display. So playing things like Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast in a 960p resolution is perfectly balanced. It is awesome. And of course, we've got all the performance power that we need to be able to play these systems upscaled to this resolution as well. So this is an ideal way to play many of these games. Another system that plays really well is PlayStation Portable. This one at a 3x resolution, and every game I threw at it played just fine. I was a little bit worried about playing 16:9 content on this display, but it actually is relatively large. It's 4.3 inches, and I think that's actually pretty decent. At the very least, it's a larger screen size than the original PSP, and of course it's upscaled 3x as well, so this is an excellent PSP experience all around. And even games like Final Fantasy Tactics, which are more text-heavy, is still very easy to read. And so yeah, I think you'll be able to play just about any PSP game here no problem. Now, the only retro system where I actually had to go in and tweak settings depending on the game was Sega Saturn. For the vast majority of the games, you can use the Beetle core in RetroArch, which is one of the more accurate cores, so many games are going to play really well here. And when you combine that with the CRT beam shader or additional CRT shaders on top of that, I think it looks really good. You can use things like CRT Geom or maybe the ZFast CRT shaders, which are a little bit more lightweight, and this will allow you to play the vast majority of the games in that Beetle core. There were very few games I found to struggle, but there were a couple. For example, Last Bronx. This one, just playing in the Beetle core, no shaders or anything else like that, only ran at about 56 or 57 frames per second, so it was getting a little bit of audio stuttering and slowdown. Now, this can be easily fixed by using a different core. For example, the Yabasan Shiro one, even with the CRT beam and ZFast shader, it's still playing at full speed. So I would say the entire Saturn catalog is playable, but you may have to make some adjustments here and there depending on the game. Now, moving into the systems that are usually harder to run, I started with Nintendo 3DS. The big thing here is that we've only got one screen to work with. So depending on the game, you may have to toggle between the different layouts, but I've always found that the best games to play on 3DS with a single screen are those where you can play just looking at that one single screen. But at least from a performance standpoint, I have found that 3DS plays perfectly fine. Now, one of the bigger factors of the RG477M is that this CPU is powerful enough to be able to play through the majority of GameCube and PS2 catalogs at upscaled resolutions. And the best fit I found is a 2x resolution upscale, which is very close to the resolution of the screen itself depending on the game that you're playing. And for the most part, I found it to be a plug-and-play device when it comes to these games. So just throw it at a 2x resolution, throw on the game, maybe swap between OpenGL and Vulkan backend, and that's it. You don't have to do any additional tweaks. This is exactly where I love to be when it comes to playing things like GameCube and PS2. And there really is something magical about playing GameCube and PS2 games at that native 4:3 aspect ratio on a large 4.7-inch screen with double the native resolution of the actual game. So not only is it like having a pocket GameCube, but it's like having a pocket remastered version of GameCube as well. It's pretty awesome. And yes, in terms of performance, I couldn't find a single GameCube game that ran into any problems. It is a very similar story with Nintendo Wii in terms of performance, but you have to be a bit more choosy about which games you prefer to play. For many of the games, they will run at a native 4:3, and that's ideal. It's essentially the same thing as that GameCube experience. It's awesome. But there are quite a few games, especially first-party games, that only had 16:9 as an option, which means that, new Super Mario Bros. Or Donkey Kong Country Returns, these only will play in 16:9. Now, like I said previously, 16:9 is not terrible on this display. It's still going to be 4.3 inches, but it does make me wish that I could play these games in a native 4:3 instead. And I'm happy to report that it's a very similar experience when it comes to PlayStation 2 as well. Just about every single game is going to be set and forget. So for the most part, I set it to a Vulkan backend with a 2x resolution upscale, and that was it. Every once in a while, I'd have to do a little tweak here or there with the game settings, mostly for compatibility reasons. Like some of these games are just hard to emulate. But for the most part, yes, every single game I tried had no problem. And it's really hard to overstate how important it is to be able to play GameCube and PS2. For example, on the PS2 alone, there were something like 4,000 games released across all of the different regions. And so that is 4,000 games that you can play on this device upscaled, and I think that's really impressive. Now, that being said, there were a couple hiccups I found in my emulation testing. For example, God of War 2, of all games, did get a little bit of slowdown here and there. It was just a fraction of the time every once in a while, but something worth noting. And I think some of this may have to do with the fact that the clock speeds on this are a little bit lower than the RG557, because that device played this game at 2.5x resolution no problem. So I'm not going to say that every PS2 game is going to play at full speed with a 2x resolution, but the vast majority will. It's going to be hard to find games that don't run well, which is a very good sign. Now, the last system I tested in terms of emulation was the Nintendo Switch. There's a new version of the Eden emulator that came out a few days ago, and it has vastly improved performance on Android-based handhelds, including this one. The Dimensity 8300 chip inside of the RG477M is at a bit of a disadvantage when it comes to high-end emulation because it's running with Mali GPU drivers, which generally have poor compatibility. But I was surprised to find that this new Eden emulator update actually improves compatibility with many games. Now, generally I would recommend sticking with the lighter weight and maybe indie style games, but I was surprised to find how many games actually played no problem. A good example of how much the performance has improved is with a game like Hades, which was a stuttery mess on the RG557, which, like I mentioned before, benchmarked at a higher score than the one that we're testing here today. However, you can see on the RG477M, this is getting very close to a stable 60 frames per second. In fact, it's to the point where I would consider this to be playable. So like with all of these handhelds, I would not recommend buying this specifically for Nintendo Switch emulation, but if you don't mind dealing with that somewhat smaller screen because it is 16:9 squished on a 4:3 display, and you're content to mostly play these lightweight indie games, then yes, this is actually a pretty good fit. In terms of the upper limit of performance, I would recommend checking out games like Super Mario Wonder or Super Mario 3D World. You're going to get some stutters here and there as the shaders compile, but in general, once you start playing these games for more than like maybe 10 minutes, they actually get pretty great. But also bear in mind that compatibility here is not perfect, especially compared to the Snapdragon alternatives. Games like Ori and the Blind Forest are still crashing as soon as I load them up. Same thing with like Octopath Traveler 2, which has all these glitchy graphics. So it is relatively hit and miss which games are going to work well, but it might be worth experimenting with, especially with this new update to the Eden emulator. Now moving on to Android gaming, this is about what I expected with a couple disappointments here and there. When it comes to your standard Android stuff, like Stardew Valley and Minecraft, yeah, all these games play absolutely fine. However, it was pretty easy to find performance problems when playing Android games. For example, with Dead Cells, I was not able to play it in the high resolution mode. I had to just use the standard graphics, and that actually played really well, but the graphics weren't quite as crisp. For other games like Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown, it was pretty easy to see that this was getting stutters even in the intro. So there are going to be some high-end Android games that don't play at full speed. A lot of it probably comes down to optimizations, and I don't think the Prince of Persia game is well optimized. For example, Wuthering Waves, which I think is well optimized, played great. So this game was playing at 60 frames per second with the high settings in multiple different environments. And so yeah, there's probably going to be plenty of Android games that will play well. However, even in my brief testing, it was pretty easy to find games that had problems. For example, Grid Legends would not boot at all. It said the device was not compatible. Or other games like Diablo Immortal would play at 60 frames per second high settings, but the onboard controls were not detected, and so I was not able to actually play this game outside of just using the touchscreen controls. And these issues are not uncommon with Anbernic's Android builds. They are always having issues trying to get some of these controllers to work. Another great example is NVIDIA GeForce Now, which allows you to stream at 120 frames per second, which I thought was going to be awesome. It would match the display, but unfortunately, again, the controls are not registering. So I would say in general, the Android gaming platform is a little bit hit and miss. There are going to be some games that aren't compatible, or maybe the controller isn't going to register, but others will play perfectly fine. So in the end, I was able to do some game streaming, for example, Xbox Cloud Gaming, but just not other things like NVIDIA GeForce Now. And so you may have to pick and choose what things you can actually play on the RG477M, unless Anbernic can create a fix of their own. Okay, moving on, let's talk about battery life. So I did 4 different tests right here, and all of them are at 50% brightness, 50% volume. I also ran everything at a 120 Hz refresh rate, and it's also worth noting that my standby time was 2% overnight. That means that over an 8-hour period, the battery drained only 2% while in sleep mode. Let's start with the far right. So this is going to be Yoshi's Island on the Super Nintendo running RetroArch with the CRT beam shader and the auto mode turned on, as well as the auto fan. That means the fan is going to lightly run to keep the device cool, and we are running it at 120 Hz refresh rate, so it's a bit more demanding than just playing it at 60 Hz. In this example, I got 8.5 hours of gameplay time, and so if you're going to be playing lightweight stuff, this is about what I would expect, somewhere between like 8 and 10 hours. Now next up, I moved into GameCube, but I chose a lightweight game, Animal Crossing. That way I could play it at 2x resolution, but with the auto mode turned on, same thing with the auto fan. So we're not pushing the CPU into the high mode just yet. And in this example, I got 6 hours and 45 minutes of gameplay. I think that's actually pretty great to be able to play some lightweight GameCube and PS2 games. games. Now, not every game is going to play at full speed with the auto mode, so you'll have to kick it into high mode with many other PS2 and GameCube games. And so I used God of War as my example here. So here I'm pushing it pretty hard and I got 3 hours and 2 minutes. So that's what I would expect with the high-end PS2 and GameCube games. And then finally, just to see the worst case scenario, I also ran the Wildlife Extreme stress test multiple times to see how long it took to actually drain the battery in high mode. And so here the worst case scenario was 2 hours and 47 minutes. And so you can kind of see the spectrum of battery life to expect with this handheld. Okay, and finally, last thing before wrapping up, I did a quick teardown just to have a look inside of the handheld. First thing I noticed is that there's a heat shield all the way across the back here, so they are definitely mindful of the heat transfer on this device. I think it's a good thing. Now the shield itself is held in place by 2 very small cables, and so I did not take them out. Instead, I just kind of rotated it to see what I could find underneath. On the right side, you can see the battery and the speaker, and then the analog stick, which also happens to have the Wi-Fi antenna attached to it. It's a little bit harder to see on the left side, but there is the CPU. It's under a little metal heat shield below the fan, and it's also quite a bit away from the battery, which I think is a good thing. In general, it's a very clean look inside of it. Everything is nicely organized, and I like the fact that they have this large heat shield to kind of dissipate the heat before it gets to the shell. All right, I think that's all the testing I can manage. So let's go ahead and start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I dislike about the Anbernic RG477M. I think first and foremost is the fact that this kind of feels like a dream machine. I have used so many of these Anbernic handhelds over the years, and I've always wanted them to tweak one thing or fix another, and it feels like they actually did that with this one. We finally got a 4:3 aspect ratio device with D-pad centric controls and a beautiful, large, monster screen. The 960p resolution allows us to scale a ton of different games, and I love that it's 120 Hz as well, because we can improve the motion clarity too. And I think when you combine all those together, especially with that fancy metal shell, this is a really premium style experience. It's also great that the controls are awesome too. In fact, I think this has got a perfect D-pad when it comes to Anbernic devices that are made out of metal. We've also got a very performant chipset, and we can play all the way up to GameCube and PS2 easily, to the point where it's basically plug and play. And when you put together all these factors, it feels like this is a handheld where Anbernic is actually building it for the retro handheld community. There's a long-running joke in the Anbernic handheld community where essentially Anbernic always makes a device that it's not quite perfect, where they pull something back. Maybe they make really small joysticks on a large handheld, or, something just really odd. And this is the first time where it feels like they were like, okay, you know what? Let's just give them what they want. And I've been testing Anbernic handheld since 2020, and this is the first time where I've really felt that very clearly, where it feels like a handheld built for us. Now, of course, it's not perfect. There are some things that I think could be better. So let's talk about some of the things I don't like about it. Number one is the fact that the fan is noisy. I think that once you start playing the high-end stuff, it's really hard to ignore. And so that's probably my least favorite thing among all the stuff that we're going to talk about here. The inline shoulder buttons are a bit of a trade-off as well. It does make the device more pocketable, but it's less comfortable to use than stacked shoulder buttons. So I'm kind of mixed about this one as well, because I appreciate that it's pocketable, but I also wish it was more comfortable. By nature of being a metal handheld, it also gets quite warm as you're playing it. Not to the point of being hot, and I think not to the point of being unpleasant, but it does make me wish that we had a plastic version as well. I also found this handheld had imperfect compatibility with certain emulators and games. Now, in emulation, I did expect it because it has Mali drivers, which means that with high-end emulation, it's not going to really stack up against the Qualcomm competitors. But I was also disappointed to find that the controls did not register with certain games, including NVIDIA GeForce Now, which I think would have been a slam dunk. I also found the battery life was just okay in my own testing. Now, I was playing it at 120 Hz and also turning the fan on just to keep the device cool, but I think that's the ideal way to play this device, and so that's the way I tested it. And I found that at best, I was getting somewhere between like 8.5 and 9 hours. Now, this is not the end of the world. In fact, I think it's pretty decent for low-end emulation, but I think that I would love to have seen it in double digits, especially with this battery size. And then finally, there's no getting around the fact that this is not a cheap handheld. It starts at $240 before shipping. So it is an expensive handheld, all things considered, but I think when you put together all of its features, that price point does make some sense. We've got a metal shell with a performance chip and a beautiful display that goes up to 120 Hz. And so this handheld can be many things at once. It is expensive, but I would not say it's overpriced. At $240, that makes it $10 more than the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 with the Snapdragon 865, and I think that's about where it should land. And probably the biggest thing that I kept coming back to in this review period was just how far we've come from the RG475M when this launched about 2.5 years ago. It really does feel like the RG477M is that first true successor to this beloved metal handheld. If we just compare some of the major stats, you can see that it's a huge improvement in just about every single way. In the end, $240+ for a retro handheld is a lot of money. But I think among all the dozens and dozens of handhelds that Anbernic has made over the years, this one feels the closest to a one-and-done experience. If you're like me and you prioritize retro gaming with excellent visuals and really nice controls, then this one really feels like a handheld you can buy now and just ignore the next releases for several years to come. In other words, this is a rare Anbernic handheld that feels like a desert island device. If I never saw another Anbernic handheld in the future, I would still be very happy with this output, because I think that they've really hit it here. Now, I reserve my right to change my mind if they make a plastic version of this, but as it stands right now, I think that this is now my favorite Anbernic handheld of all time. At the very least, it's my easiest Anbernic recommendation of 2025, which is saying something, because they've released some pretty good handhelds this year. So putting it all together, yes, I do recommend the RG477M if you are wanting to focus on retro gaming with a nice, big, beautiful screen, and you want a premium experience which comes with a metal handheld. If you already own a handheld and you're happy with it, then it's probably not worth picking this one up just because of that higher price point. But if you're now just jumping in, or you're looking to upgrade something that's kind of long in the tooth, then yes, I think this will be an excellent experience. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and as always, thank you for watching this very long review video. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found it helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.